is Benji Cole, son of Al Cole from CBS Radio and host of the syndicated talk show, People of Distinction. A talk that gives you an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. Run to our website, alcoleenterprises.com, for more info. Email me through benji@alcoleenterprises.com if you'd like to get involved with what we have going. And as always, please continue to like and follow our broadcasts. People of Distinction is internationally syndicated solely due to the love and support that you all continue to give. We're available across all major distributors, and as long as you keep following, we're going to continue to put out the content. Now sit back and strap in, because on the line with us today, we have the impressive David Wagner. Now we're going to be discussing David's incredible book, Ordinary People, Americans Falling In and Out of Poverty. It's Amazon, it's Barnes & Noble, man, it's a lot of other places. But the one-stop shop for it all, that's going to be his personal website, davidwagnerbooks.net. There, you're going to gather more information on him, as well as the 11 other books that David has written. I promise you, man, once we begin today's discussion, you're going to see David, he's a smart brother. He understands what he's talking about, and the subject matter that we're about to discuss is something he is known and researched for years, so understand it's coming from a knowledgeable place. Once again, that's davidwagnerbooks.net. And I quickly want to point out the fact that David was brought to us by Citi of Books. So for my writers out there listening in right now, if you find yourself in a difficult position because you've written this book, but you have to find a way to move it, you got to contact Citi of Books, people. Head on over to citiofbooks.com and gather all of the ways that their fantastic team is going to help you do just that. And listen, it is an absolute pleasure to have David here on the line. Man, people, listen, right there in the title, or primarily in the subtitle, Americans Falling In and Out of Poverty, you got an idea of the discussion at hand. But I promise you, an idea is all you got. We are going to take a deep dive today. We are going to discuss how poverty isn't a fixed destiny. It's more of a current, right, that pulls people, as the title says, in and out. A story that we, unfortunately so, have been telling wrong for centuries. In his book, David unearths the gripping, untold lives of 19th century Americans who cycled through an almshouse. Some escaping poverty, others trapped in it. And through this, he reveals the eerie parallels that happened then, but juxtaposing it against today's economy. This isn't just history. In my opinion, it's a mirror. And it's going to have you asking yourself some pretty tough questions, man. It's not just something that is going to be an education based upon how people used to live, but it's going to force you to look within. It's going to force you to look at today's society, today's economy, and ask, why do we still blame individuals instead of systems? And what if everything we think we know about the quote-unquote rags to riches is actually a myth? Listen, man, I'm telling you, sit back and strap in. Have your notebooks ready. David is about to offer a fantastic education, and I'm here for it, man. Let's go. David, first and foremost, welcome to People of Distinction, and thank you very much for being a guest. How are you doing today, sir?
Thank you, Benji, very much.
Listen, David, it is a pleasure. I was telling you on the pre-screening call, man, I think this book is remarkable, not only because of the magnificent research that you have done in bringing so many stories from the past back to life, but the parallels, man, the things that can be learned from it. I think if we can approach this with, it's like my mom always used to say, we got two ears and one mouth for a reason, man. No disrespect, but if people can just shut up and listen, man, we might learn a thing or two here, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, sure.
David, let's start off, man. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background.
Okay, I'm born in the height of the baby boom in 1950 in Brooklyn, New York. I mentioned to you earlier my mother frequently saying, "You're driving me into the poorhouse." And of course, like most Americans, we use the word, but we have little idea what we're talking about. There was a time, and it lasted about 150 years, where every town in America, just about every town in America, had a poorhouse. Some of them had several, And there was distinctions between some of them, too. For example, some towns had a workhouse where they put the poor to work. Some put the poor to work just for the punishment's sake of it. You'll also hear about poor farms. That was simply, they were looking for work for the poor. Of course, agricultural work in those days seemed very possible. You didn't need a lot of skill, and you'll hear of that, too. But there's nothing exotic to it. It was found by many of us who study it to be an awful place because usually they were budgeted as low as possible in the scheme of municipal or town finances. And there were a lot of people, like we've seen scandals and other kinds of facilities, that were just in awful situations when they were opened up. And often the only thing an inmate, as they were called, really could do to better the situation was actually, when the modern era of cameras started filming, was to call for an investigation. And most towns did have a mechanism to do that and to share what was actually going on in that institution, which often was very chilling. Anyway, growing up in a family that faced head-on into a possibility of low-income status, but also were extremely education-oriented, despite the fact that my parents never got more than high school. But from the time I was 3 or 4, they said my name was like, you're going to college. Like automatic. And I found myself at 4 or 5 listing all the presidents and listing all the capitals and whatever else they could show me off as. And I did happily, through all this, be in good enough shape to get to Columbia University, which was also an issue of how we would afford it. But I got a New York State scholarship, and I worked a couple of jobs. And I was a little surprised when my roommates went to their yachts. Columbia was a more affluent place in those days. But I had a great time. I went in the 60s and 70s, and Columbia, like Berkeley on the West Coast, was very much the center of activity, of all sorts of radical activities, sit-ins, whatnot. And later on, I did get my master's at Columbia in social work as well, and worked in social work for about 6 years. And then worked in labor organizing and labor management relations. And then finally in my 30s, I got a PhD at the Citi University of New York in sociology. So while I am a professor, as you mentioned earlier, I have a sense of my life in the real nature of life, not in any sort of ivory tower. Because when you work in social work, you're working out and trying to get people to unionize. These are very, very tough jobs, very human jobs. And you're going to be sweating. And so I never really embraced the idea of academia someplace away. I mean, obviously some teachers do, but I was very active in my teaching as well. I taught for 28 years at the University of Southern Maine in Portland, Maine. And finally, in our mid-60s, my wife and I moved out here to California after having 28 winters in Maine. My dad, we needed some warm weather.
Absolutely. Listen, as a New England boy myself, I get it.
Right. And I did write, as of a few years ago, when I took a little break, 12 books. And I got to try to figure out how I got there. I guess I always thought a lot of, when I thought about, particularly sociology, writing and trying to organize aspects of life, at least in America. Some people do it across nationally. And I was very lucky. My doctoral dissertation was published as a book, but my second book involved the homeless, and it was still in the period where homelessness was being seen for the first time by a lot of people. It was being defined, argued about, etc. And in 1990, I began a study up in southern Maine and got to know just about everybody who not only was on the streets then, but people who had been on the streets. And I wrote a book called Checkerboard Square, Cultural Resistance in a Homeless Community. That was published in 1993. And the lucky part of it is I went on to win a pretty big book award with this, which I was extremely surprised about. C. Wright Mills was a very well-known sociologist. And in fact, there are terms such as white collar, which he coined. Power elite was another book of his that for a long time, power elite was a term. And in any case, I was extremely surprised because I knew I was nominated. But when I looked at the other 4 nominees, I went, oh, my God. In fact, I made no plans to go to the conference that year where it was awarded. And then my publisher, my editor called me and said, "You're not going?" I had just come from Europe like the day before, and I was very surprised. Once you have that opportunity where your book wins a big award, you have to step up and try. Try at least to show yourself, show your flag that you were good enough. I don't mean to anybody else, but yourself, that you were really, they made a good choice.
Absolutely.
And then in 2005, my book that, at least for the last 20 years, has actually been the bestseller of my books, was called The Poorhouse. Because in studying and re-going through history and seeing about this term, "You drive me to the poorhouse," I found that nobody had really done justice to a history. I mostly used New England poorhouses and did not win any awards, but it's still, people are buying it. And I think everyone I speak to who has read it, makes the same point that Benji made earlier about the currency of it. That even though these were houses set aside for the poor, which seem very archaic to us today, what was going on with the people who were in there, what was going on with the people who run these places, very much like today.
Absolutely. After
my Poorhouse book came out, I tended to do some running around, at least in New England. I lived in Maine then. And in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, which is outside of Lowell, really big 19th century textile town, I found in this building labeled Massachusetts State Almshouse. And getting approval to visit, a man named Chet Kennedy, who was a very active octogenarian, showed me that within these offices, the closets were full of books actually falling apart. It looked like a library that had been run down and run over. And I just couldn't, finding what turned out to be 75,000 books of biographies of inmates, I just couldn't find a way to leave it alone, having just done the Poorhouse book. And although the biographies are not probably today what we would think of as a biography, they tended to usually be 2 or 3 pages of script identifying the inmate, as they were called, and why they came there, sometimes what their stay was like, and sometimes their death or their discharge to somewhere else. Of course, I sampled it. I didn't do each and every one of them, but the inmate biographies were a really unusual place to find things for researchers. So I can't ignore this, because here's 75,000 poor people who were studied during the 30 years of 1865 to 1895. I added to it by using census data and genealogical data, so that for some people I have as much as 60 years of data. And at some point, I'll talk a little about a couple of examples of downward mobility and of upward mobility, because at first it seems like, wow, everybody's falling into poverty. But then I looked at some other years and the census data and found that there were people in the poorhouse who did fairly well in the years after. Right. So we find both the upward and the downward mobility.
David, thank you very much for that. And people, listen, I started off by saying this man knows his stuff. Listen to his resume and you understand. The background speaks for itself, man. This is something, again, that's coming from an educated and a very knowledgeable place. I want to, before we go into that upward and downward mobility, let's talk about some parallels here. Because, listen, people, we're not going to cover everything here today, okay? And for the sake of time, I want to get to really what I think is so valuable in all of this. David, your book challenges the myth of the quote-unquote undeserving poor. Because today we still see narratives of people on welfare and, of course, the common phrase of lazy millennials. And this all still persists. Why do you think these stereotypes recycle over centuries?
Oh, boy, that's probably an hour interview right there. They do because, first of all, some people want them to. There are people who ideologically believe, or not so ideologically, but they believe somewhere else in the stomach or something, that people who are poor are evil. When I say that, I don't know how a person who is religious, for example, can construct such a view, since we're all God's children.
Exactly.
We all, I think, are deserving of aid when we're down and out, and assistance from one another before we get down and out. So I have trouble personally seeing that. But obviously, there are people and there are organizations and ideological centers that want to believe and want to make it so difficult for someone to get food stamps or Medicaid or welfare. And that was true, of course, 200 years ago also.
Yeah.
The poor were extremely stigmatized, and the poorhouse was meant to be a visible symbol that you are an outcast. You were there with mentally ill people very often, mentally retarded. You had battered women in there. All sorts of people were put together, criminals. And then eventually, 19th century to the 20th, we get some separation between prisoners who are sent to prison, women who, let's say, are sent to places for disabled or battered women. So we get a little bit away from just throwing everybody into one pan. And the other is, I think, the shame carries on to people who have touched poverty or are afraid of poverty, and they don't want to talk about very often their own issues and problems because they feel like it will blame themselves in some way.
Yeah.
Now, everybody has things in their life that don't go 100% right. But to simply say that those in poverty are to blame for it is really, I think, a serious misreading of life here and, of course, around the world. There really isn't any reason for it except the fact that it makes the poor more controllable by having people say, oh, I'm so ashamed of this, I'm not even going to talk about it. Which diseases are like that too, right? You don't want to admit if you've been to a psychiatric clinic or something, and that has gotten better. Some things have gotten better over the years, but we do still suffer from shame for a certain number of causes.
David, listen, man, I know this is a much longer conversation. This is a deeper conversation. We can invite you back onto the network another 15 times, and we still would only have scratched the surface of the nuances found within. And people, this is why you got to head on over and purchase your copies. Remember, the book is entitled Ordinary People, Americans Falling In and Out of Poverty. It's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, a whole host of other places, but make sure, check out his personal website, davidwagnerbooks.net. One-stop shop for it all. And there is so much here that you're going to grapple with because that's really what this is. And David, you did something wonderful by categorizing your book or entitling your book Ordinary People, because it truly gets to the heart of so much. You've mentioned this. We've, of course, been able to speculate. But when you're talking about it and why that is such a great title is it showcases the fact that your book shows how sudden illness or injury would take these quote unquote ordinary people, these people from respectable or quote unquote respectable communities, and all of a sudden now they find themselves burdened and put into these positions, much like today, where people who are ordinary find themselves in poverty-stricken situations due to medical bankruptcies or so many other things that are a system-related problem that is now put onto them. And that, I think, is something that is so key to all of this and really where I want to go next, okay? Because, listen, at the point in history in which your book focuses on, there were the almshouses. Now, today, we see shelters. We see these tent cities populating a lot of areas. Did your research reveal patterns in who became chronically unhoused versus those who bounced back quickly? Let's talk a little bit more about that build up and that breakdown. Tell us what you think.
In this period, you had millions of immigrants coming to the United States, and most of our parents, I think, and grandparents, and I have quite a bit about both immigration and migration from the States. And Canada had its own diaspora as well. Had hundreds of thousands of people left Canada. They had their crop years. The 1870s was a terrible depression era.
Yeah.
And within that, people had even better chances. The man named David Ring, who was an Irish immigrant who lived in New York, he had a career in rail. He worked as a rail worker. The problem was the conditions in rail really don't improve until around 1900.
Yeah.
And in 1860, he was the victim of one of his legs. He was a victim of an injury to his leg, which is going to keep him out of work. And for a while, his wife ran a small store, which they lived on. And then all of a sudden, she was reported to have used up all her means. David Rain entered the poorhouse that year. He did find sympathy from a member of the overseers of the poor. Those are the ones who run it in his native Salem, Massachusetts. Those officials responsible for administrating his life called him a clever, old, unfortunate man. Give him all the liberty you can. And he died at 68. Another man William Fowler, who was called one of the first citizens of Lowell, Mass., that is, one of the elite. And this man had, for the time, in the 1860s, a pretty good net worth of $13,000. He was a wooden coal dealer. What happened to Fowler is not 100% clear. They weren't really diagnosing. They were just reporting what people said. Whether his getting older had to do with that, at one point he probably has wandered away from home. He does seem like he could be a little demented. These aren't doctors, but that's a possibility. Now, his family actually made out okay, but his own worth did decline in 1870 when he entered the poorhouse. Ruth May is another one from this period of time. She was an inmate in 1880, and despite the fact that her husband passed away, she was a fairly affluent widow, because, again, I took these people off the list of the money they were showing was actually pretty good. But unfortunately, like a lot of old people in those days, they didn't really make it to old age. Remember, there's no Social Security. There aren't many investments that are open to people who are poor. And she would also die in the poorhouse. And another man I chronicled, James Dooley, was also an Irish immigrant who had done pretty well in the 1860s and early 1870s until 1874. And again, it doesn't always say completely what happened to the person. How much was just the bad economy, because it was a depression, and how much may have been illness or loss of family. Dooley suffered, he was a subcontractor, owned several houses, but he suffered a loss of property, job, or home, which must have been devastating. And in some cases, such as Dooley's, led to severe grief, which is, of course, not surprising. Over and over, we hear these stories, and the downwardly mobile people are pretty easy to find in these 75,000 people. What surprised me a little more, though, was that when I went back through my records, I saw there were a number of people who were upwardly mobile. Now, one thing that happened is that we all live through economic times, which we're individuals, but we all share in an era. And the 1860s, 1870s looked like a pretty tough era, both to economists and sociologists and others. You have a long depression in the 1870s, but also remember, coming out of the Civil War, you have all sorts of changes in the economy, changes in groups of people who are milling around trying to redo their life after the tremendous tragedy of the Civil War. But by 1880 and the years that follow it, things are better in America. That is, the economy it goes into a depression in 1893. But other than that, let's take 1880 to 1920, the economy is a little better than it was, and industrialization has taken off. So you get people like Frank Cross, who was sent to the poorhouse at 10 years old because his father was arrested. We find Cross in the early 20th century. He was a mechanic. He owned land. He had a family, and he owned his house. 3 children named Briggs were in the Almshouse house in 1895. One of the Briggs children went on to become a police officer. Another one became a blacksmith, and the third one a tailor. In the census data. Jenny Grafton, 1876. I found her several years later owning a house with her husband, who was a farmer. Nelson Peterson goes from, and sometimes if you can get them in census every year, you get this one you can really see upwardly mobile. He was a farmer. He was a cutter in a cotton mill, but in 1920 he was a construction foreman, which probably had a decent wage to it, as they do now. Ellen Quilty, who became a nurse. Quite a few women who entered nursing now. Again, we don't always know in that period of time. We don't yet have degrees in a lot of places for nursing. Ellen Rhodes, 1885, became a music teacher. Elisa Ruthley, also a nurse. By 1895, her son was a lawyer, which is pretty good, and she had $15,000 in property, which was pretty good.
Yeah.
So there you see this, as I call it, fluidity of poverty. That is, it's not a straightforward thing. Some people are going to be pulled upward, like the last 7 or 8 I mentioned, and others, like 4 or 5 I mentioned earlier, were pulled downward by the Depression. So we're all sitting in one place, thinking it's just us, but in fact these are very broad trends that happen to us, and we have to find a way of adjusting. The world says adjust, do what you have to. And this, as I think Benji mentioned before, is pretty much the world we inhabit today as well. You could say this is 100 years ago, but in fact, the types of upward and downward mobility are really quite the same. The descriptions of the jobs obviously will have changed.
Right.
How much money you need to have enough to eat and maybe go to a movie or do what you need to has changed, and of course it's drastically different in different places, even in the United States. For example, living in California or New York will give you an idea of what it takes to live that's very high.
Yeah. As
compared to being in Arkansas or Wyoming or something. And so all of those factors are working on us, and there are a lot of people, as we speak, that are falling back into poverty. The other problem, it's like the issue of shame, is nobody really wants to define poverty. The U.S. has a poverty rate that's so low that basically all the fields, like all the academics, we laugh at it. There have been attempts to change the measuring of poverty, but because we don't really want to measure it, there's a lot of vagueness. Are you poor? Am I poor? I feel poor.
David, I think that brings up a great point. And listen, maybe it's something that we can quickly touch up on, but for time purposes, people, you understand what you got to do. You're talking about the records that are being kept. And we mentioned this in the pre-screening call. When you were doing your research in these individuals from in and out of these almshouses, records were meticulously kept. There's a lot of information, and that visibility hasn't transferred to today, where there is a lot of missing pieces of information for one reason or another.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, again, as we close out, do you think that visibility helped or could potentially hinder between the two?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually, because some things have occurred for presumably favorable things, such as privacy law, particularly with the patients or inmates. I don't call them inmates anymore, but particularly with groups of people that may have a lot of poor in them. I don't know. I think partly that is true, that it becomes harder. But the bigger thing is the shame thing, because the people were really still proud of what they did and proud of their work and could say, look, I only make $15,000, $20,000 a year, but what I do is worth it or something. If they owned it, right, shall we say, then it would be easier for all of us to say, what can we do for you? What can we do together, for example? So I think, yes, there are things that make it difficult, definitely. But still, most poor people are not institutionalized, as they were back with the Poor Act. So in a way, we have less to blame on the system, in the sense that nobody's really stopping you from complaining or from trying to get help or trying to organize people. It feels like nobody wants you to do that. That is true. But we're still not in the totalitarian society where people are holding you back. Obviously, I think it will come a time when people's reactions to some of the things we see today may be very different. Absolutely. They were even different in real life, the 60s and 70s, than they are now.
David, listen, man, like I mentioned, we've barely scratched the surface, man. Like the image that keeps coming to mind is the commonly used reference when you're seeing an iceberg, right? People, trust me, we've covered a lot here today, but there's just that tip of the iceberg that's peeking through the water. You dive deep and Absolutely. There is so much more to be uncovered. I'm going to leave it up to you now. It's Amazon, it's Barnes & Noble, it's DavidWagnerBooks.net. Remember, the book is entitled Ordinary People, Americans Falling In and Out of Poverty. And while you're at it, remember, David has 11 other books that you're going to want to get your hands on. We didn't get an opportunity to go into a discussion with them today, but make sure you head on over there and you do your due diligence and check them out. Because if there's one thing that I'm taking from this, and listen, It's an uncomfortable truth to confront. Poverty has always been a cycle. It isn't a life sentence, yet we keep telling ourselves the same old myths about who deserves help and who doesn't. Yes. His book is going to help showcase and shine light on the fact that the system, not the individual, usually decides who sinks and who swims. And I want to make sure that I highlight and emphasize usually, because it's not a blanket statement, right? I'm not here to just blame everything on the system, but that has a huge part to play in all of this. So I'm left, as I know you all are as well, with the real question. And the real question isn't how people fall into poverty. It's why we keep letting history repeat itself. Oh no, man. This book is the precipice to a lot, but it has me thinking maybe it's time we start to rewrite that ending. Okay, because, man, we're going to journey through the past and we're going to help fight for economic justice in the present, because it's not just a historical thing. It's happening right now. And the onus is on you and I to do something about it, man. David, this has been an absolute pleasure. Keep up the fantastic work. And once again, thank you for being a guest on People of Distinction.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and it was also a pleasure doing it.